Deep in the middle of nowhere, America, in the early hours of March 3rd, 1980, a girl is born. She was the apple of her parents' eyes. From that day on, she could do no wrong. Every birthday was a celebration of her greatness. As she grew into womanhood, she stumbled not once. Her beliefs were always in line with modern thinking, and her opinions were never the wrong ones. If you were to ask them, her folks would put her on par with the angels, as near as to divine and beautiful as humanly possible. This is all BS, of course. The girl was never honest with her elders, not fair to her peers. In school, her grades were average at best. Her awkward fumblings with boys were well known. No one around her age respected or liked her. There were a few she controlled through fear, but in time, even they would break away. The child was nothing like the divine creature her parents viewed her to be. You ask, how do you know all this? Well, you see, I was foolish enough to marry her. I'll refer to her as Alicia from here on. Alicia and I had known one another since middle school. We'd grown up not far apart. Her beauty was a truly breathtaking thing to behold, but it was her only redeeming value. For some strange reason, I was the guy she chose. Over time, I'd come to discover why. Her upbringing had made her an abusive narcissist. This was a major turnoff for most guys on her level. I guess guys on my level were more susceptible to her feminine powers. She knew she had me on the hook from the beginning, but not once did she abuse me the way she did everyone else. I'm not sure I would have broken it off if she had. The relationship had its ups and downs like most do. Every few months we'd get into an argument and break up, only be back together soon after. Anytime society robbed her of something, which was often, I was the one there to prop her up. Maybe at the time I actually believed the world was out to get her. She certainly did. Through every bit of drama, I never considered life without her in it. That's certainly why I followed her to community college, despite being accepted to Stanford. I honestly thought that we'd be moving there after 2 years anyway. Per usual, she barely survived those 2 years. Her grades were terrible, and she had to appeal after flunking out of her first semester. I would do all her homework after that and drill her relentlessly until she passed. She was never really stupid. She'd just been raised to believe everything was hers by right. At the end of that time period, she took a terrible job for her friend's interior design company. When I brought up moving to California, she claimed her job was too important to give up. After a lot of inner conflict, I gave up my dream of Stanford and found a nearby university to attend. 4 years would fly by. I continued on with school while she bounced from one dead-end job to the other. Our first daughter was born along this time. Alicia took a long time to bounce back mentally, but when our second daughter arrived 3 years later, she seemed fine. By then, I was teaching at the high school. A last-minute death in the staff meant I was filling in as a wrestling coach too. This meant I was spending less time at home. Alicia had long since quit working to raise the girls, a situation I had no problem with. Unfortunately, this gave her time to brood. She began accusing me of having an affair. The saddest aspect of all this was the fact that I still loved her just as much as the day we met. I never once thought of other women. The accusations broke my heart. The claims of cheating had been going on for almost 6 months. Strangely, one day they all stopped. 2 days passed until I had a free day to spend with her and the girls. Everything was great all throughout the day. She even cooked me a wonderful dinner. Afterwards, I was so exhausted I let her know that I was turning in early. I expected this would make her mad, but she looked angry. I should have known things weren't right when she tucked me in. She'd never been the type to do that, not even for the kids. It didn't set off any alarms at the time, though, and soon I was sound asleep. At some point, I was awakened by a sharp pain in my chest. I fought to wake up. I also noticed a pounding sensation. I finally got my eyes open and I saw a form on my chest banging on it repeatedly. I was in that state where I wasn't sure if I was dreaming. Waking up was strangely difficult, but I eventually managed to do it. With my eyes wide open now, I could tell that form was Alicia. I couldn't understand what she was doing, but I knew it hurt. I summed up all the power I could and pushed her off. I ran my hand across my chest and felt a wetness. It took a second to realize that she had been stabbing me. That was when I began to panic. She was already attempting to mount me again, but I fought her off. I knew I had to get away. My legs felt like I was running through the mud, and I didn't know why. I did make it to the door before she jumped on my back and renewed her attack. My survival instincts had kicked in now, and I slung her to the floor, but she sprung back at me. I impulsively struck her twice across the chin, which knocked her out cold. I'm still amazed at what I did. It was something I know I couldn't have done in any other circumstance. This gave me a chance to get a phone and call for help. Our oldest had been awakened by all the noise. She noticed the blood all over me and began to cry. I covered it up by saying I'd spilled ketchup on myself, and I'm not sure she bought it, but she did go back to bed when I asked her to. By now, I could hear Alicia trying to escape from the bedroom. I was in no condition to stop her. I now know she had drugged me. I ran into the hall bathroom and locked myself in. Only now did the blood loss begin to affect me. The dispatcher did her best to keep me awake, bless her heart, but within a few minutes, everything went black. When I regained consciousness the following day, the pain was agonizing. My yelling alerted a nurse who came in and adjusted my IV. Not much happened for a few days. I remember short spurts of consciousness, but not much more. On the fourth day, I awoke on my own, still uncomfortable but feeling better. A nurse arrived and let me know which buttons did what. She left and returned a little while later with breakfast. It was the first time in my life I'd ever had grits. I was so hungry I devoured everything. After lunch is when the cops showed up. I certainly wasn't expecting what I'd heard. It turned out that Alicia tried to rush the responding officers with a knife and they shot her. She had survived and was recuperating just down the hall. And on a positive note, my girls were staying with my mom. I thank her to this day for having the presence of mind not to bring them to me. This all happened in 2008, and I wasn't able to fully explain the entire mess to them for a few years. For the sake of brevity, I was released later that week, and Alicia was transferred to the county jail a few days later. She soon took a plea and agreed to 15 years. With all that resolved, I tried to focus on my daughters. I've been fortunate enough to have two supportive parents who've helped me out a lot. Sacrificing my teaching job was something of a disappointment, but administration gave me a regular 9-to-5 arrangement. My oldest is nearing graduation, and her sister isn't far behind. I'm amazed at how well they've handled everything, especially growing up into womanhood without a mother. Alicia reached out to them once or twice, but they refused the invitation. I'm never bad to talk to her around them, even after what she did. The choice had always been left up to them. At the end of the day, I think Alicia is the one who suffered the most from all of this. Listen, I'm not making her a victim. She was 100% responsible for her actions, but I know for a fact being away from her daughters was torture. The wounds she'd received never fully healed. The few times I did speak to her, she made mention of her constant pain. Then, just as she was nearing the end of her sentence, she contracted COVID and passed away. It definitely wasn't an ending anyone deserves. Not even her.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel as essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
The older I become, I'm less and less capable of ignoring my prior bad actions. I recently turned 36. It's no longer possible for me to hide what I took part in or act as if I don't feel an indescribable level of guilt. I'm writing this anonymously to confess my crime in some ways. My fear of prison equals only to the loss of my family. Being separated from them would be a fate worse than death. Had I not become sober, The truth would have probably died with me, and this is going to have to do. Once the story is posted, the account will be abandoned and left to the whims of Reddit. Contacting me will just be a waste of time, and it's better if you simply read this and go about your day. This confession is made for my own sake alone, and nobody needs to act on this information, and you'll garner no benefit in doing so. My troubles likely stem from my childhood. My parents, unlike many of my friends, remain married to this day. Punishment was never unwarranted or excessive, but it was the only real time I was given attention by my father. He merely existed as a financial resource. Even now, we have no real emotional connection. I include this information only to illustrate the feelings of emptiness I've carried for most of my life. On the other hand, I could have been born emotionally stunted from the beginning. I suppose the reasons matter little when you get down to it. To most, they will be nothing more than cowardly excuses, and either way, what I'm about to say is disgusting and should be viewed as such. I know what I did was wrong. The real problems began when I left home for college. Not being particularly smart put me at a considerable disadvantage. My grades were already low before I made friends of the locals, but it didn't take long for me to begin my long slide down. For the sake of anonymity, I'll call these two guys Mike and Kevin. We met at a local dive bar that served us underage. My parents didn't drink, and I've only ever drunk once in my life before college. This gave me a very warped relationship with alcohol. From the start, I drank until I barfed, every time. That's probably why those two liked me so much. I had no off button once I got started, just like them. Soon enough, I was doing drugs with them. I don't mean a little pot either. I dove right into the deep end and barely treaded water for the next 14 years. You can guess what happened. By sophomore year, I was kicked out. I didn't bother to tell my parents. They just kind of guessed after I stopped coming home for holidays. Honestly, I'm actually glad it happened. I'm not left with the crippling debt most of my peers have. But anyhow, I began doing small jobs and selling drugs to get by. Things like coke and X mainly. Partying became the sole focus of my life. My personal drinking and drug use was growing out of control, and this resulted in the story I'm about to share. I'd like to think I wouldn't have done anything like it otherwise. It took place on one of my booze and dope-filled binges. I was with Kevin. I'm not sure where Mike was. I don't guess it matters anyhow. I do recall that we'd been getting high since around lunchtime. It was already way after dark when we got to the bar. Just by chance, we ran into another guy from the neighborhood. He was a few years younger and had that little brother, annoying hanger-on vibe about him. As the night drew on, this kid got drunker and drunker. He became very verbally aggressive with us. I'm not sure if he thought he was being funny or felt tough. It didn't matter. After an hour of this, we'd had enough. When he stumbled off to the can, we started making plans. Not to kill him, but give him a butt-kicking he'd never forget. He returned and we invited him along to get some coke. He was down with it, but we had other plans though. We all piled into my car and drove out to a quiet place we'd been to before. We didn't see it coming from what I could tell. Even as we stood before him preparing to beat him up, he was still asking about the blow. I believe I was the first to hit him. After that, no one was keeping score. In retrospect, a sober me would have stopped far sooner, but neither of us were anything close to it. The beating went on for about 5 minutes. To our credit, I don't think we kicked him in the head. Like I said, it was just to teach him a lesson. When we were done, we flipped him over, and he was still breathing. I remember that specifically. I also recall the rattle sound in his throat as he did. In our drug-addled minds, we thought it was so funny to leave him out in the middle of nowhere. So we leaned his battered body against a tree and left him there. Not once did I think he was dead or close to it. I'd been beaten far worse in the past and partied the next day. Speaking of the next day, the horror of what we'd done hit me hard. I tried to justify it in my mind. When I could no longer do so, I got high to forget. This went on until I was able to ignore it. We weren't sure if the beating would be enough to stop the kid from coming around. We hoped it would, but if it didn't, we hoped he'd at least keep his tongue in check from then on. Drugs were the only reason we'd hung out with him in the first place. When he disappeared, I don't remember anyone missing him or even mentioning him after that. This incident was a mere blip in my downward spiral of alcohol and drug addiction. I was able to put it behind me in a terrifyingly quick amount of time. Several more instances would occur, but none reached the level of depravity that this subject did. Years would pass in a blur. My so-called friends would sell me out the first chance they got. Even then, that night was never mentioned. Although I may sound bitter about what they did, jail would prove to be a godsend. Unable to get high for the first time in years, I was forced to face my problems. All but one. For a long time, I wasn't sure if it even occurred. I know now this was just my brain's way of coping. Now that I've been clean for over 4 years, the truth of that night is becoming more transparent by the days. There hasn't been a night in the last year that I haven't relived it in my dreams. Perhaps nightmares would be a better word. Last night was the final straw. Awaking soaked in sweat and screaming, as my wife called me, was the end of the road. If I didn't at least tell someone what happened, I would soon go mad. And telling my wife isn't possible. I would rather die. She knows some of my past, but I'm sure hearing this would destroy her love for me. That is a sacrifice I would make to no one. You may have noticed I'd never stated whether the victim in question died from that beating. The truth is, I don't know. I've been too afraid to search out any information. Being certain would probably drive me to make an irrevocable choice. A choice that would positively destroy my family. For the time being, I have to hope this confession may alleviate at least some of the crushing disgust and guilt I feel. If it does, what I do doesn't affect you in any way. Therefore, the reader's part ends here. Whether or not you think about this matter the seconds after you click away, for the good of yourself and those you love around you, think twice before you step onto the path of drugs and alcohol. My wife should serve as an example to you. I once considered myself a kind and decent person. I'm sure you can see that drug use has stripped that from me. If you don't care about yourself, remember, there are others who do.
Growing up in California, I would hear my older brother and his friends talking about these abandoned towns that were scattered throughout the desert. They would always go exploring in abandoned buildings and towns, and when they would tell me their stories, it would always sound so cool. This is why my family wasn't too surprised that as soon as my friends and I could drive, we began doing the exact same thing. For the most part, we would visit places that my brother had told us about, but there were a few occasions where we would see something online and decided to be the first ones to check it out. For the most part, this led to some pretty cool stories to share when we would all hang out on the beach. But there was one occasion that always haunted me and my two buddies, Dylan and Mateo. The three of us had heard of this ghost town that was out in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and we thought it would be a great place to visit for the day and go exploring. And when a weekend came up that all of us were available, we packed our cameras and began our trip. The drive took about 3 hours, and the last hour of it was particularly barren. There were almost no signs of life outside of the occasional gas station and rest areas. Finally, we made it to the town, and immediately you could tell it had been abandoned for years. Most of the houses were single-story homes, with most, if not all, of the windows smashed out, and a lot of them even had their roofs caving in on them. We spent the first hour or so just walking along the road and peeking into the houses from the outside. Most of them were locked, so we didn't want to break in. However, there was one building that caught our eye. At the end of one of the tiny side roads leading off of the town, we noticed there was one house that had tarps covering up broken parts of the roof. Out of curiosity, we approached. It almost looked like someone had turned it into a makeshift home. I think that was when we all got a little freaked out, as we all simultaneously realized that we might not actually be alone in this supposedly abandoned town in the middle of nowhere. Mateo calmed Dylan and me down, and we all collectively figured that maybe someone was squatting there, but the odds of them still living there seemed small, so we slowly approached it to check out what might have been left behind. As I approached the window, I made sure to listen closely for the sound of anyone moving around inside, but from what I could tell, it was vacant. I pressed my face against the glass, and through the fog, created every time I exhaled, I could see all of the torn and tattered furniture that sat alongside a heap of trash left behind by whoever had been staying there. I signaled to Dylan and Mateo to come to check it out, but just as they got to the window, I noticed something that told me we had been wrong. Sitting on a small end table beside the couch was a handgun of sorts, and I could tell even from that distance that it was the cleanest thing in the house, meaning someone was inside. That was when we all heard the sound of vehicles approaching. We couldn't tell what kind, but it sounded like dirt bikes or maybe ATVs. Dylan and Mateo turned to see where the sound was coming from, and before I could join them, we all heard a yell come from inside of the house. A man had come around the corner into the room and was standing directly across from the window. His yell caused all of us to jump, and we began running away as fast as we could. We ducked through the yards that connected the abandoned house and did our best to stay out of sight as the sound of vehicles got closer and eventually passed us in the direction of the house where we were running from. We all made it back to the car, which was parked about a half a mile down the road. As we began to turn around, we could hear something that truly terrified us. Those vehicles were back, and it sounded like they were heading our way. Mateo quickly turned the car around, and we headed home as quickly as we could. When I walked inside my house, I was relieved to see my brother so I could tell him what had happened to us. That was when he told us that he had heard of the ghost town we visited, and they never went there because it used to be a known drug den. The police had apparently busted multiple meth labs in those houses over the past decade. A group of friends and I had always wanted to go camping in the Nevada desert, so when we all finally got the opportunity to do so, we all jumped at it. It was a 3-day camping trip, and we made sure that we had more than enough supplies to deal with the extremely hot days and cold evenings. The first night was indescribable. I mean, they always say that the sky over the desert at night is something of wonder, but I had never seen that many stars in my life. We spent most of the next day walking around. We went on a decent hike that lasted about 2 hours before returning to camp and getting our food going. From that point on, we just read our books and enjoyed some music that we played through a battery-powered speaker that we brought with us. As the sun fell in the sky, we welcomed what we expected to be another beautiful night, but we were sadly mistaken. We all sat beside the fire as we let it get smaller so we could see the stars better. When my friend Francis began to tap me on the shoulder, I asked him what he needed, and instead of telling me, he just pointed off in the distance. Now we were miles away from any civilization, so you can imagine how surprised we were to see what appeared to be another person standing about 20 feet away from our camp, just staring in our direction. We got everyone else's attention, and by the time they were all looking, the figure began to walk closer to us. That's when I decided it might be best to call out to them, so I yelled hello and asked if we could help them with something. They didn't respond at all. They just kept getting closer. At this point, they were right at the edge of our camp and continued to walk through. We all stood up from our seats and kept asking them if they were okay and if they needed help, but there was no answer. They didn't even look at us as we tried to talk to them. It was a grown man who slowly made his way right through the middle of our camp and then continued walking. That night, we decided to stay up because we weren't sure if they would come back or not. But around 2 a.m, the wind began to kick up and our fire ended up being blown out. If it weren't for the stars in the sky, we would have been in total darkness. We spent the next 2 hours waiting for the sun to come up. And after about 20 minutes of darkness, our worst fears came true. We could see the figure that we saw before lurking around in the distance. We all stayed close to each other, still unsure about what he wanted. There were a few occasions where the man got close to our camp, but he just seemed to be aimlessly walking back and forth. It was terrifying, but he oddly didn't seem to want anything to do with us. As the sun began to rise, we all began to pack up our things. Though nothing happened to us, there was no way we could do another night out there. As we were packing our things, I kept looking out into the distance, wondering if I would see the man who had been stalking us, but there was no sign of him anywhere. We left the area without a trace of us being there, and haven't talked about going back since. When I was 27 years old, I decided I wanted to be adventurous, and one of the things that I always wanted to do was go on the Appalachian Trail hike. So I decided to plot out a 4-day section of the hike and ask my dad if he would drop me off at my starting point and pick me up 4 days later at a spot that I designated on the map and GPS. He was more than happy to help me, and before I knew it, my hike began. Days 1 and 2 were just fine. I was making good pace for a while, and it was actually looking like I might reach my pickup point a day early. That would have been fine though, as I would just camp out and take the day to relax and get a good night's sleep. Halfway through my 3rd day, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. I assumed it was just some animal and nothing for me to be too concerned with. But after swearing, I heard shuffling behind me. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. That was when I noticed what looked like a bit of fur poking out from behind a tree. As soon as the animal poked his head out to look in my direction, I could clearly see the head of a mountain lion. He noticed me looking at him and took off running off the trail and into the woods. I was confused and concerned, as I never encountered a mountain lion before, and I was essentially in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't stand there for long though, and I decided to keep my pace and continue walking through the trail. Sure enough though, about 5 minutes after I continued walking, I got that feeling again, and I just knew that I was being followed. I decided it might be safer for me to end my trip sooner than later, so I stopped on the trail and quickly pulled out my map. I could feel the 2 eyes staring at me from beyond the tree somewhere. I just couldn't take the time to find out which one. As soon as I looked at my map, I found the nearest pickup location and called my father. I think he could hear the panic in my voice, because he told me to hurry to the parking lot and that he would meet me there. I had a 4-mile run ahead of me, but I did my best to pace myself. I had to take a few small breaks to catch my breath, but as I got closer to my destination, that feeling of being followed slowly faded. By the time I had gotten to the parking lot, I could see my dad's car. I quickly ran to it and explained to him what had happened. We both made our way home and tried to forget about the whole thing, but it's something I still can't quite shake.
This happened about 3 years ago. I was hanging out with my friends, Austin, Vincent, Charlie, and Bobby, while my parents were gone for the weekend. On Saturday afternoon, me and my friends were hanging out playing Battlefield 1 at Austin's house, chilling and having a good time. A couple hours later, we got bored and had nothing to do, but we went on a walk on a boardwalk, talking about what plans we had for the summer. After we talked about our summer plans, my friend Austin asked if we can go to the abandoned hospital. But I was thinking, that wouldn't be a good idea, because it might be frightening and scary, but I agreed. Around 5 p.m., we got into my pickup truck and drove there. We got there around 6:30 p.m., and I parked my truck next to the entrance in case anything happens while we're checking the hospital out. When we got inside the hospital, it was a little bit creepy, but the hallways and the other rooms were empty. About 20 minutes later, we heard something that made our hearts drop. It was the sound of a girl screaming, saying, "Help, somebody help me." Then I heard someone saying, "Shut your mouth." We followed the sound all the way up the stairs, and when we got there, we saw a dim light from the room. As we got closer, I told my friends to not move a muscle. As I peeked through the room, I saw a girl taped to the chair. After I looked at the girl, I quietly told my friends to come to the room and help. After we helped the girl, she thanked us. She told us her name was Hannah. She also said that she was kidnapped by a man 3 weeks ago while coming home from college for the summer. We decided to get back to my truck, but suddenly we saw a movement coming from the stairway, and we decided to find an empty dark room and hid there until someone passed us. After a minute or two of hiding in the dark room, we saw some guy wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, boots, and holding a machete. After the man passed us, we got out the room quietly without making any noise. Before we got to the exit, we heard the man screaming and yelling for the girl. We started running to my truck, so my friends jumped in the back of the bed, and then we quickly started the engine. And as I started the engine, my friend Austin yelled for me to hurry up. After my friend Austin yelled, I looked behind us, and it was the man charging us with the machete. So I quickly drove off and called the police. After we escaped, we pulled in at a gas station, waiting for the cops to show up, and told them exactly what happened. After we told the police where the hospital was, they went over there and investigated, and they caught the man surprisingly. He was taken into custody and got charged with kidnapping. After the police took him away, they told us they've been looking for this guy for 5 years and said he had prior convictions. The ambulance took her to the hospital, and then we went home and decided to never go to places like that again. I still can't stop thinking about what would have happened if that guy would have caught us. More importantly, what would have happened to Hannah if we never showed up.